this point was somehow involved in collusion here.
Thank you, Bob Woodward. No one less than Bob Woodward saying that. So even the left has to respect what Bob Woodward says, right? He brought down a president. So we'll get to a little more on this. We've got some of the clips from Spicer today at his news conference, and we'll play those for you coming up here shortly. One of the things we talked to Jay Ashcroft about in the last hour was the end of the legislative session, what passed, what didn't pass, because let's just face it, there were a lot of things that maybe didn't get done that should have in this legislative session. Our friend Senator Bill Eigel calling in us from St. Charles County District to give us more on sort of a rundown of what did and didn't happen in the legislative session. Bill, how are you?
I'm great, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you bet. I'm glad you could give us some time today. So the big issue for me, and my assumption now is that the governor would sign it, is the minimum wage preemption bill. I had you on the show last week trying to have you give me the odds on whether or not that was going to get a vote or not. And in the end, you had to do the previous question rule to shut down debate just to get it voted on.
We did, and we were willing to go that distance for it. Senator Nasheed in downtown St. Louis was filibustering that bill, and she had filibustered it for several hours leading up to the final day. But we met together as a Republican caucus, and I think there was a tremendous amount of support that ultimately did show up in the vote that we identified we needed to get that bill done. And there's probably few things I can point to that will have more of a positive effect on the St. Louis area, because we were about to be subject to a much higher minimum wage that we can point to and say we got that done and it's good for our area.
Absolutely. And I've got people from the left calling into this show wanting to claim, but what about local control? Why can't they have input on this? And St. Louis, I've heard it said that the St. Louis area is the economic engine of the state, and if you've got a big chunk of it in the city of St. Louis throttling small business with a silly hike in the minimum wage that's unnecessary like this, that slows that engine down even more.
Well, I've heard this argument about local control, and for what it's worth, I think a lot of the folks that are trying to preach this issue as a local control issue don't really believe in the concept of local control in the first place. And quite frankly, local control does not mean that we sit aside as a state and stay out of topics when clearly the actions that are being taken by a city, a county, or some sort of municipality would infringe upon the rights of the citizens living there. And I think when you have government trying to dictate what wage level should be, you're already starting out near the edge. And clearly, when you're talking about raising the minimum wage beyond what is set for the rest of the state, that goes into territory that we have a responsibility to intervene on behalf of the citizens and the businesses that are working there. Yeah,
that's a good point. Speaking of that, let's talk about, I know that the Blue Alert law did pass. It looks like the governor's going to sign that one. That was almost a no-brainer, but there were people on the left, particularly who kept bringing up the Ferguson issue, who weren't in support of the idea of harsher actions against people that harm police officers.
Yeah, they weren't, although I think that most of the Blue Alert language is really a notification system. And I think we do, on one hand, have to be very careful when we're talking about treating people differently under the law, because we have protections for equal protection in there. But I think this was about standing up for our police officers who are risking their lives every single day. It passed both the House and the Senate, and I think you're right. I think the governor's going to sign that.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Let's talk about a few of the things that didn't get passed this year. We talked a lot about the prevailing wage law. That kind of went down to defeat. Were you in support of that? Not in support of it? Tell me how that came out at the end.
Yeah, I was in support. I am in support of the prevailing wage reform proposals that were put in front of the Senate. I'll say this: I think there was a broad interest across the Senate body to get something done on prevailing wage, reforming it, repealing it, what have you. What we didn't have is a consensus on what that looked like. I think you could probably break the Senate into thirds. A third of the Senate did not want to do anything with the prevailing wage law. A third of the Senate wanted to repeal the prevailing wage law, and a third of the Senate just wanted to reform the prevailing wage law. So we really didn't have enough time on the floor to come to the right consensus that we could move forward with, which is why I don't think we were ever going to see any kind of action to the level of a PQ or whatnot with prevailing wage. I do, however, think that that's going to be a top issue going into next year.
Okay, well, that's good to know. A lot of people were hoping for the prescription drug registration. I know I'm probably not using the right word. Was that the PDMP?
The PDMP, the Prescription Drug Monitoring Program, yeah.
Right. And that didn't pass, although it seemed to have a decent amount of support around the state.
It did, and this is something that I've been against for a long time, and the reason is twofold. One, if you look at the effectiveness of these types of government databases with respect to opioid prescriptions around the country, we're the only state that doesn't have one, but in a lot of states, the programs that are being run are very ineffective. So I wanted to make sure that if we were going to get a program that, one, we were protecting the privacy and the liberty of the citizens that were being forced into this database, and secondly, that the amendments that were put onto the bill would ensure that we would see some sort of positive movement in the fight against opioid abuse. The product that came out of the Senate 2 weeks ago had several amendments on there that a group of conservative senators, which includes myself, had put onto the bill to make sure that we were doing as much as we could to protect the privacy of the citizens and at the same time make sure that it was going to be effective. There was a requirement for doctors to use it, and secondly, there were also some limitations on how long certain prescriptions and data would remain in the database.
Right.
This last week, there was a movement to strip out all those protections. So the effect of that was the PDMP broke down and it didn't get done.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm sure you're going to see that again next year too, because
we will.
everybody, there are a lot of people chomping at the bit to get that thing put in place. Ethics reform seemed to be the issue that plugged up the Senate to some extent. There were a couple of different versions of that, and my understanding is none of them passed, correct?
Yeah, unfortunately, none of them passed. There were some ethics reform measures out there that I was very vocal about supporting, bans on gifts from lobbyists, extension of term limits for some of the statewide offices that don't have them right now,
right.
Some additional expansion of the revolving door for legislators who want to become lobbyists. I was supportive of all of those things. None of them made it to the finish line. There were some things that I wasn't supportive of, which was charitable donation disclosure. The idea is now that we have campaign contribution limits, a lot of donation and money is flowing into charitable groups that are supporting candidates and issues. There was a movement to expose the donors to those groups, but I felt very clearly, I think we talked about this last week on your show, I felt very clearly that was an invasion of folks' privacies when they were trying to take part in the political process via the charitable contribution. So that didn't make it to the finish line. So we're still a ways off from consensus on those, but my hope is we're going to move forward on several of those pieces of legislation next year. Plus,
I mean, you're in a similar situation in the next legislature, right? I mean, supermajority, obviously Republican governor, so you should be sitting pretty. I read some comments in the Post today that some of the leaders in the minority were happy that they had managed to slow down the system enough that only like 58 bills passed the Senate or something this year, I think was the number that I read. That's got to be a little frustrating.
Well, yes and no. I mean, generally, I'm a proponent of the idea that less government is the best government.
Sure.
So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we didn't get a lot of bills done, because I tell you what, some of the bills that we got done were big bills that had no chance of passage in previous sessions. And I'll give you a couple examples. Right to work was one of them. Reforming the labor environment in the state was a huge issue that stymied Republicans for years. We passed several major tort reform issues. Tort reform is what I commonly refer to as reforming the legal environment to get lawyers out of the way of business. So we took several measures to make the tort reform and the legal system in the state much more conducive to growing businesses. And even when we weren't passing bills, we had successes that had expanded to our educational system. I was actually carrying a couple education reform measures, but even though those didn't make it across the finish line, we did fully fund the education formula for the first time in the history of the state. So
sure.
There was a lot to be happy with, and sometimes there's so many things that you want to get done that when anything gets left off the table, and like I said, there were needed discussions about prevailing wage, about paycheck protection, which we were trying very hard to get that done yesterday, and ultimately, or on Friday, we just didn't get there. But I think round two is going to be very exciting for us when we head back in.
Senator Bill Eigel is our guest. Very quickly, there was a second right-to-work bill that came along with that emergency clause in it. Did that get out? Did that get passed or not?
It did not.
It did not.
We ultimately, I don't think the efforts for the initiative petition are going to be successful.
Okay.
So it never accelerated to be a priority for us. I can tell you that if the initiative petition does successful, we'll be watching that very carefully. And our commitment is that we're going to become a right-to-work state. And
the governor has talked about calling a special session sometime in the fall. Any idea what that's all about?
Well, I'll tell you what. The day before the session ended, the governor actually stopped by one of our offices, and I had a conversation with him about precisely that subject. And he was very candid with me. He laid out 3 or 4 things that he felt rose to the level of calling a special session, getting work done on prevailing wage, getting work done on paycheck protection, and there was a tort reform measure or 2 that he felt was very serious, and he would consider a special session for. We didn't get any of those done, so I'm interested to see now what that's going to mean in terms of him actually calling one. So,
right.
I feel like we got a lot done, but certainly I'm open to what the governor has to say.
So what happens next? I guess we won't know till August is when he would do that?
Well, he could theoretically. I think he could do it any time. He's got to make a decision if he feels that next session is the most appropriate time to do that. I will tell you that if the minimum wage preemption bill had not gotten done, because there is such a time crunch on the minimum wage law was going into effect in the city of St. Louis.
Right.
I think that would have been a special session.
Good.
But we got that done, so we got that off our plate. But now it's up to the governor. If he doesn't feel like there's a path forward in the regular session, then he may accelerate the need for something sooner. So we'll see.
As a freshman senator, was it a whirlwind for you?
Oh, absolutely. I think anytime you have a new job, it's like that. There's a learning curve.
Right.
And actually, it wasn't just a learning curve of the operation of the Senate. It was building relationships with folks that I didn't have a relationship prior to. I certainly had a good relationship with Bob Onder going into this, but most of the investment on my part was made building those bridges to other folks so we can really move forward on a good discussion in future years. I felt we had a lot of success doing that. And at the same time, as you know, we were successful in showing our independence where necessary, when we weren't just down there just to go along to get along. So I think we've struck a real good balance. But we were able to prevent the passage of some issues that I felt strongly against, and the prescription drug database is one of them. But we were able to get work done on things that I supported, the minimum wage preemption bill and the right to work bill. So overall, I was real happy.
All right. That is Senator Bill Eigel from the 23rd District out in St. Charles County. Bill, thanks so much for your time.
You bet, Mark. Thanks for having me. We'll talk